Hi, welcome to LPW706. I'm Dr. Carolyn Beasley. Today I'll be talking to Professor Josie Arnold about what makes a good journal entry and about other issues related to journaling. Welcome, Josie.
Hi, Carolyn. I'm glad that you've asked me about journal entries because I really am an expert.
Oh, you absolutely are. Well, you've supervised many PhD students, and journaling is an essential part of that.
That's right.
So what in your mind makes a good journal entry?
Look, I myself am a writer who doesn't keep journals, but what I do keep are bits and pieces. So in a way, I suppose that is a journal. And Dylan Thomas, of course, said he never wrote anything again after he was 19 because he had a box full of bits and pieces. And when he had a fight with his wife because they were both drunk down at the beach one day, she started to throw them out the window. So the moral of this story is however you keep a journal, it's important to keep. But for the purposes of you students of writing, I think it's incredibly important to develop this skill because the PhD really demands it. I have written about this saying that the artifact and the exegesis are drawn together by the journal so that they're not a parallel conversation. They're not an 11, they're an H. They're joined together, and they must be for the purposes of practice-led research PhDs.
And I think that's a really good point about that it becomes a collected space for anything that you want to pop in there. And I suppose what we tend to encourage students to do when they're journaling in the beginning is just to start off with some questions to yourself about any problems you might be having in a scene that you're writing about, or any creative issues you'd like to work out, something along the lines of what is the purpose of my scene, or what big dilemmas do I need to resolve? Why am I blocked? These sort of things. So that's sort of one level that you can think about in terms of journaling, is looking at creative issues, problems and blocks.
That's right, and I think that's really important again for your exegetical material in your PhD or in your master's work, because it is asking you to reflect upon your own creative process, and that is part of the new contribution to academic knowledge. And as you say, once you come up with those kinds of points, why am I blocked? How am I developing a character? What's drawing the plot forward or not? Then you have, as it were, little heads or subheads, and you say, oh yeah, well, now I need to go and find what other writers have said about being blocked, or what academics have said about the process of writing and being blocked. And there's a lot out there.
Fantastic. And that I think is, for me, the next stage of journaling is when you know you've worked out sort of what your creative problems are, and you start to ask yourself, what do other writers in the field say about this? How did they resolve those? What other aspects can critical theory bring to this? What does Roland Barthes say? What does narratology say? And then you might want to use your journal space as a kind of repository for note-taking in your academic reading about that creative problem. So you've got the one entry talking about what the problem is. Then you might say, well, how did, I don't know, James Joyce solve this? And then you might, or Brendan Behan, and you might go and research what he's done, make some notes about that, or read his work and make some comments as if you're a reviewer on what aspects of his work worked for you. And then you could then do some academic reading and make some key points about from those about your creative dilemma. So you're kind of really using it in a bowerbird approach, a bowerbird way, where you're gathering all bits of knowledge from many different sources about that one problem that you're having.
That's right, and I think this is really very important, that I've famously or infamously called this the licorice all sorts approach, where licorice all sorts bring together a multiplicity of flavours and tastes. Each one by itself is fine, but together the whole thing is much richer. So I say, okay, you have your own ideas, your own observations, your own thoughts about your work, then about the problems that have arisen from your work and how you've gone and dealt with those, and then how other writers have had problems, similar problems, and dealt with them, and then what academics have thought about these things and said about them and reflected upon them. And you've entered into that privileged academic discourse, not only at that academic end, but throughout, so that you've brought practice into the academy, which is the real point of practice-led research, practitioner-based research or studio-based research, that you bring into the academy that which is outside the academy norm, or has been outside the academy. And then that, of course, leads you to reflections upon your theories and theoretical approaches and your methodology. And all of this is a very rich mix.
Fantastic.
So I think even using coloured things when you go through your journal. You might say, well, anything that is about me, I'll make yellow. Anything that's about other writers, I'll make orange. Anything that's about other writers' books, I'll make green, and anything about academics, I'll make purple, I don't know. And you have to just see that you have plenty of purple, plenty of the academic, because the point when you get to that end of your journaling, you're using yourself as data, and you've put down all your stuff. Don't put down all the stuff about whether you're in love or not, because it just makes it such a big journal. Have that for another diary.
Josie's just talking about her journal here.
That's right. But try to keep it very much focused on yourself as the writer, yourself as data. From that, 4 or 5 major themes should arise that hopefully, maybe any colour, but that hopefully you will really use a lot of purple. But so that the journal really has a life, not only of its own as the writer's working journal, where you can reflect upon your own work, but it takes it into the other writers' reflections and works, and then into academic reflections and works. It becomes a very rich process. In the first year, I think most students will just do their own reflections upon themselves, don't you?
Yeah, very much so.
And I think that's fine.
Yeah, what methodology works for me? I'm creating today. What books have I read that'll help me create? And maybe, I want this character to do this and that.
That's right.
They'll only come to that sort of deeper academic reading as they go along a bit. But of course, our assessment is required within 12 weeks, and it is a journal. So we need to get some degree of that in each entry if possible.
And another way to do this, which I think is, I'm just working through this myself in my own thinking, is through your academic reading to take something that is really enlivening for you. I mean, for me it was Roland Barthes saying the author as God is dead. And I just was so pleased with being an author, I didn't want to be dead already. So there'll be some quote that you get from your academic reading, which, because this is only 12 weeks, is going on alongside your other writing and reading. And you might say from that, Roland Barthes or someone, Deleuze-Guattari, say this, and you have a little quote and a reference, and then you might say, this is relevant to my thinking and my work because. So you're entering into the academic discourse. You're bringing your practice, your observations about your practice, other writers, other observations, and academic observations into an academic discourse. To do that in 12 weeks is a big ask.
It is. But of course, this is where the tutors come in, because we'll read your work each week and say, this is a really interesting idea to talk about in your journal. Flag, take that on board and expand on that in your own journal space. And also we'll suggest academic approaches that you can build in as well.
And just remember that your journal is your space. And I mean, I don't know how this goes in the subject, but my idea with my PhD students is it doesn't have to be beautifully written and good spelling, but it has to be legible and understandable, but dot points are fine, and ideas that you follow through, and then you say, I'm not going to follow this anymore, that's fine too.
And that's a good point about ideas that you may not follow, because journals are a space where you can record and play and explore the avenues that may work or may not work. It doesn't matter. And I think it's important to bring to your journal the idea of play, in that you can test out ideas. It's like a sketch pad where you can just doodle away and you can erase things if you want to. Just the idea of it is your space of infinite possibility, whereas the creative work, when you hand that in LPW705B, that's a more fixed object, whereas the journal is where you test out the ideas as you go along. So the idea of play is important. You can mock up scenes, have your characters being interviewed by a psychologist if you want to, write in the voice of someone outside your gender or culture or race if you want to. It gives you a play space.
And I think importantly for this short journaling journey, I would suggest that your last journal entry might well be a summative one, where you say, in looking back over this journal, I see that these are the major points or sub-points that I want to bring forward. Would you say that was a good idea?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's actually what I did when I did my PhD. Josie was my supervisor.
Very good student.
Very good supervisor. And I went through my journal towards the end when I was writing up my exegesis, which is like your scoping document, and got a highlighter and highlighted the key themes that ran through it and wrote them along the side. For instance, home belonging. And I drew them in at the end, and I could flip through for, obviously a PhD, it was quite a large journal, but I could flip through very quickly and find the key themes that ran through. So that's always good as a way of mapping where your head is at with your themes in your work as well. And I might just conclude with one more question, which is how do you think that the journal improves the creative work?
Look, I was waiting for you to stop so I could say this, which is that all of the PhD students that I have supervised in this model have all stated that they believe themselves to be enriched as creative writers because of the thinking that they have done with the journal and the exegetical material arising from the journal. And that's how it should be. All examiners of PhDs say that the two elements should interact and should speak to one another. So in this process where you're learning in the Master of Arts writing to start keeping a journal, there are two elements I think that are useful to you as a writer. If you're going to be a writer and just go on with your creative writing, not go on with your academic work, then there's a good record of how you go about that and how I might reflect upon my writing, what happens when I hit a blank wall and da-da-da-da-da. But if you're going to go on with your academic work, there's also a starting point for you, which I think starts you off on your PhD very strongly, of thinking how to utilise that.
Absolutely. And I think for me, one of the great benefits of the journal was to look back, read over my entries and realise that I actually did have a methodology. Whenever I'm blocked in the future as a writer, I've realised now I can look back and see how I solved those problems back then. And though next time I have that creative problem, I'll remember how I solved it, or I might jump out from that and solve new creative problems. So it's also really a way of recording how you work as a writer and how you work things out. And I've finished my PhD 3 years ago, and I still go back to my journal. It's very useful.
Good. Thank you very much and good luck with your journaling.